Hi, I'm Melanie Reyes, and today I'm going to be talking about the imprisonment and the criminal justice system and how it's affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. We're going to be looking at the historic and contemporary issues impacting Indigenous children and people, and looking at the different innovations in educational support, teaching, and community development that the government and outer community is working towards. I just want to apologise in advance. I have a bit of a cough, so I'll try not to cough. So, what is the issue? The issue at hand that we're going to be discussing today was covered by an article in The Guardian in 2015, and the headline read Indigenous Youth Imprisonment Rate is Highest in 2 Decades. Landmark report warns Australia risks a lost generation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders because of failed government policies. So some statistics that we can look at to represent this great issue is this. On any given night, there are 430 Indigenous children in detention in Australia, and this is costing $1,200 each, which if you do the maths, annually it is $440,000 to keep a child in detention. And this is enough to put an Indigenous young person through an entire undergraduate medical degree. So, according to 2012 to 2013 figures, 1 in every 28 Indigenous boys aged 10 to 17 had spent time in detention, compared to 1 in 544 for non-Indigenous boys. So, this is a comparison. 1 in 28 versus 1 in 44. 1 in 544 for non-Indigenous. And in girls, it was even higher. So 1 in 113 Indigenous girls aged 10 to 17 spent time in detention, compared to 1 in 2,439 non-Indigenous girls. And the worst offending state was Western Australia, where Indigenous kids were 53 times more likely to be in detention than non-Indigenous kids. So that's twice the national average rate. So these statistics are so confronting, and they pretty much paint a picture of the representation of Indigenous youth and children in prison and in detention. Juvenile detention centres. So the question that I'm covering and leading into is, what are the factors that are contributing to the incarceration of Indigenous people? So an article for Psychiatry, Psychology and Law titled Imprisonment of Australia's Indigenous Offenders found that alcohol and, to a lesser degree, drug abuse, hopelessness, poverty, and impaired physical and mental health all played a role in answering why Indigenous Australians were part of such high statistics in relation to imprisonment. Now, looking at the historical impact. So, Indigenous Australians have faced a pretty nasty, attack against them when they were going through the colonization period, and they faced invasion, resistance, different massacres. There on the PowerPoint, I only have one where 30 Aboriginals were killed, but there's so many more reported massacres that occurred, as well as forceful attempts of assimilation. This is where we saw the stolen generation occur, amongst other violent acts that have changed their circumstances forever. Now, what does this have to do with where they are now, where the issue is now? So this historical impact has brought us along to where we are today, which is the issue of belonging. Aboriginal families today carry the trauma of up to 5 generations, and that trauma means that we have higher rates of incarceration, higher rates of drug and alcohol abuse, higher rates of issues around our personal health, but also communally how we live and how we view and perceive ourselves. And this is an account of someone who was a part of the stolen generation. And yeah, they are pretty much talking about their experience of being removed and how this trauma in the past still carries on today. So we're going to do a quick activity to just examine how the past is connected to now. And we're going to have a chance at being jurors of the court, looking at our criminal justice system and testing out what we think, how far justice should be spread, I guess you could say. So we're going to examine the criminal justice system. This is a real case that occurred. So it was called the Munda versus Western Australia case. So background. Ernest Munda, a traditional Aboriginal man, was convicted of manslaughter of his spouse in 2019, but I'm sure it was in 2019. An offence punishable of up to 20 years imprisonment. I think I was supposed to write 2010. So so pretty much he was convicted of manslaughter against his wife, and this offence is punishable of up to 20 years. He already had a history of offence commencing in 1997, and he pleaded guilty and cooperated with police. Now we're going to look at the areas of consideration that affected his sentence. Alright, so a strong area of consideration was that he was a traditional Aboriginal man. This mitigated his sentence in 3 ways. So by mitigated, we mean this lessened his sentence in 3 ways. So the fact that he was an Aboriginal man meant that he was seen differently, and his sentence was thus treated differently. And I'm going to tell you why. These are the 3 ways that his sentence was lessened. First one, an imprisonment sentence would be served in a prison away from his community. So this was a point of consideration. They looked at, of course, how important it was for a traditional Aboriginal man to be in his community, and thus keeping him away for a long period of time was going to be have a great effect on him. Also, they took into account that he was at a social disadvantage, coming from an Aboriginal community that have conditioned members to accept alcohol and violence as a way of life. So this was another consideration. They looked at how technically his community and the way that they accept alcohol and violence translated into him acting with that same violence. And so it was pretty much saying it was partially not his fault that he has been conditioned in that way. And the third area of consideration was that they received a letter by senior men from Walmajari, Wankatjunka and Gooniyandi, people from the Fitzroy Valley, to explain that Munda would undergo traditional punishment, which was flogging with sticks and nulla-nullas by members of the dead wife's family. So another point of consideration that he wasn't just going to get punished by the criminal justice system, but also by the traditional people. And so this brings me to our discussion. Looking at the different ways that these considerations affected his sentence and even lessened his sentence, I want to ask you this. How does the history of Indigenous Australians still find itself present today? Should Munda's sentence be mitigated because he was a traditional Aboriginal man? And is the criminal justice system being fair in keeping this historical context in mind? So, areas to discuss would be, is it really fair to lessen someone's punishment or someone's sentence because of their background, because they are an Aboriginal man, because of the community they may have grown up in? Are these all areas that we need to keep in mind? Does history play a big role? Should it play a big role? Is that something that we and by we I mean the government, owes to them in, I guess, in exchange for how they took away their culture and traditions. So yeah, that's just a small activity just to outline how the criminal justice system does change and adapt to Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander cases. But moving on, we're going to look at the innovations in educational support, teaching, or community development. So Mick Gooda, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner, comments that the statistics that we looked at, the issue that we're covering today is a national emergency. He said in The Guardian in 2015, we need an approach that starts to address the underlying causes of crime and starts to divert resources away from imprisonment and into local communities. This is a justice reinvestment approach that suggests that both early intervention and community responses are necessary to achieve long-term change. And so this brings me to this video. And this video was put on Late Line, and it was a news coverage of the issue that we're covering today. But it took more of a focus on what kind of changes were being brought, what innovations in educational support, teaching, and community development needed to occur to bring about change. So I'm going to play it now.
The nation's Social Justice Commissioner has demanded action over the spiralling rate of Indigenous incarceration, which he's labelled a catastrophe and a human rights crisis. Despite progress in some other measures, the number of Indigenous people behind bars has risen by nearly 60% in the past 15 years. In his latest report, Mick Gooda says reducing rates of imprisonment is the most urgent social justice challenge facing the country. This report from Jessica Kidd.
Around half of all young people in juvenile detention are Indigenous, and Indigenous incarceration has jumped 57% since the year 2000.
That's a sad indictment when you think of kids getting their education in prison instead of at a high school somewhere.
And the figures show young Indigenous people are more likely to return to prison than they are to stay in school.
That's just a catastrophe in anyone's language.
The Social Justice Commissioner says Indigenous incarceration is an intergenerational problem.
We know of people in houses or families where people have been put in jail, they're more likely to go to jail themselves. So these intergenerational effects start happening and building on each other, and we're getting this cohort of people who basically become institutionalised really young, and that continues right through to the adult age.
Mick Gooda has launched his 5th report card on the state of Indigenous affairs. In it, he makes 3 recommendations to reduce Indigenous offending. He wants to see justice targets adopted as part of the Closing the Gap goals, more justice reinvestment, money diverted from the criminal justice system to prevent crime, and cooperation between governments and the newly formed National Justice Coalition representing Aboriginal communities. Including justice targets in Closing the Gap would require the federal government to report its progress to Parliament.
It's a goal, it's something you want to try to achieve, and it focuses the mind on what you need to bring those numbers down.
A 2-year trial of justice reinvestment is already underway in the northwestern New South Wales town of Burke. The collaboration between the Indigenous community, the police and local courts is trying to address the root causes of Indigenous crime and stop it happening, rather than punishing the offenders.
Justice reinvestment is very much a data-driven approach, so it would look at what is causing crime in that particular community. So looking at drug and alcohol, mental health, education, employment. What about those key areas is causing crime in that community?
The government's being urged to adopt the recommendations, if only to improve its budget bottom line.
The billions of dollars we're spending in Australia locking Aboriginal people up could be spent on giving Aboriginal people a better say in their future.
The government says it's determined to bring down Indigenous incarceration rates, but it's ruled out more targets. Instead, it says it will focus on delivering practical frontline services to improve the lives of Indigenous Australians. Jessica Kidd, Lateline.
Awesome. So that's just a look at what the news covered, what Mike Gooder said. And just to recap, some of the areas that I think that he covered that are really going to be effective are those about advising the federal government to step in and overturn tough on crime laws in WA and Queensland. So it's all about breaking that cycle. Once they're in prison, pretty much they continue their lives down that track. So it's about overturning that tough on crime mentality and giving them just a little bit more leniency so that they don't fall into that same cycle, as well as including justice and victim of violence targets in the National Closing the Gap strategy. Another area was recognizing that fetal alcohol spectrum disorders is a disability, and it's something that is so high and common within Aboriginal and Indigenous communities. So keeping that in mind, that there's some disabilities that need to be recognised that are catalysts for crime and addiction, as well as making a national commitment to a justice reinvestment approach to find community-based solutions to youth crime. So yes, these are all areas that I think the government is working towards that are going to be effective and long term. So thank you so much for listening. These are my references, and yeah, thank you.